Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to an analytical session on techno-authoritarianism or digital authoritarianism. I do want to very briefly give you an overview of the terminology because there are many such terms that are thrown out, and unless the analyst has a specific definition, it's really vacuous rhetoric. The fact is that since the coincidence of the rise of neoliberalism, which really has its historical antecedents during the Jimmy Carter administration in the late 1970s, but institutionalized by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. The coincidence of that and the rise of the new technologies, high tech, from the internet, especially, and social media, especially in the 1990s during the Bill Clinton presidency, we have seen the evolution of high tech assuming a core role in both the public and the private sector, to the degree that it's reminiscent, that this reminds me at least of what was a saying back in the 1950s during the Eisenhower administration, when President Dwight Eisenhower nominated Charlie Wilson, the CEO of General Motors, and during confirmation hearings, the defense secretary nominee was asked if he could see a scenario where there could be adverse conditions for the company where he was heading CEO, the chief executive officer, and the national interests. And his reply was, what's good for the country is good for GM and vice versa. And that became, much to Charlie Wilson's regret, that was translated as what's good for GM is good for America. In other words, the national interest, the national economic interest, the national security interest was really tantamount to whatever further the interests of a corporation, meaning corporate America. Well, today, in the 2020s, we can argue that's what's good for Silicon Valley, what's good for big tech, valued, depending on market conditions, of course, which change on a daily basis, valued at approximately 13 trillion, which is a staggering amount of money for this industry, super concentrated capital here. What's good for Silicon Valley is good for America, except that they have taken it farther than Charlie Wilson back in the 1950s during the Eisenhower administration, when he basically argued that he did not foresee conditions where there would be something that's good for the country and not necessarily good for General Motors. So today, however, what we have with high tech, with big tech, especially with the advent of artificial intelligence as a pretext, by the way, nothing more than that, is the argument that what's good for Silicon Valley is not only good for America, but it's necessary, it's inevitable, it must be embraced. And if the US doesn't do it and be dominant on a world scale in this domain, China will do it. And of course, China, it is true that China is competing, Japan is competing, South Korea, Taiwan, the European countries from Germany to Holland and so forth, and Britain. That is true. India is in there. So there is the identification of a specific corporate sector with the national economic interests of a nation state and with national security interests. The question, of course, is whether there is something here in the mix, especially as the state has been morphed, it has been um, uh, manufactured, if you will, it has evolved, perhaps it's a better word, it has evolved from the days of Ronald Reagan, who institutionalized the neoliberal model of privatization of public assets and public services, deregulation of the public sector to the lowest possible degree, anti-trade union, anti-labor policies, corporate welfare system, including subsidies, corporate subsidies, and corporate bailouts, including big banks, by the way, from the S&L crisis back then in the late 80s, 86, 87, to the Great Recession bailouts of 2008. All of that as part of the neoliberal political economy, with a state essentially existing for the sake of buttressing the private sector, and within the private sector, one particular group, namely high tech, emerging by the 1990s, and certainly today, with its roughly 13 trillion market cap, as the hegemonic sector and involved in the public and private uh, sector, whether in the domain of intelligence and defense, whether in the domain of medical science. It's involved in everything, marketing, no matter what you can conceive of. Social media, of course, we'll discuss some of these things, and making itself as indispensable and alarmingly pursuing monopolistic practices and using the state to make sure that it retains privileges and the road to monopoly, um, or at least, if not monopoly, although there are many scholars, by the way, and analysts who argue that it is indeed monopolistic, if not monopoly, and they use companies like Google, Microsoft, and so forth, NVIDIA, oligopolistic. Let's use the word, which, by the way, both monopoly and oligopoly are ancient Greek words. Monopoly means sale of one, literally one company, one entity, being in business, having no competition, zero competition. Oligopoly means few entities are involved in a competitive struggle. So now the question here is, can these entities coexist under a pluralistic liberal democratic model, or is there a contradiction ideologically and, of course, in the real world in practice, considering that democracy does mean constraints on the very powerful, constraints on those seeking hegemony, observance of the American, let's take the United States, although this is a world model, observance of the US Constitution rather than trying to go beyond it, go beyond the law and the Constitution, bending the laws and the Constitution. And therefore, having these companies observe on the surface level, observe the rhetoric of liberal democracy, the rhetoric of pluralism, the rhetoric of diversity, but in reality pursuing policies that further authoritarianism. Now, authoritarianism simply means lack of accountability to both the law and the public. Authoritarianism is something that the great English philosopher John Locke, the father of Western liberalism, warned about when he wrote about tyranny during the Glorious Revolution, when he published his work on um, the question of what constitutes the best form of government and what type of social contract must there be, and concluding that the legislative branch, in the case of England, of course, the parliament, in the case of the US, much later after the independence, the Congress, the Senate, and the House, that the legislative branch must be above the executive. And here is where the problem rests with big tech not wanting to be under legislative constraints, whether it is in a country like the United States, where much of big tech is based, although big tech obviously is all over the world, or whether in Europe, where the European Union really has made some efforts to bring big tech under some control. Now, interestingly enough, big tech, especially big tech executives, started out in the 1990s as presenters, at least again on the surface, not only in the lifestyle, wearing blue jeans and a t-shirt like the one I'm wearing, as liberals, pluralists, diversity oriented, and so forth, presenting themselves as progressive. After all, they were in high tech and science, right? They're supposed to be progressive. Except that was very hollow. Their goal, their corporate goal, was in line with a neoliberal political economy model. And that meant maximizing profit, deregulation to the highest degree possible, low taxes, corporate subsidies, securing contracts from the government, and making sure that countries around the world that try to regulate these entities were at least, I don't want to say stopped, but at least they were lobbied on the behalf of Silicon Valley by the US government and with all its considerable influence on a world scale. So this is a very important issue here. Now, which is important because the evolution of neoliberalism in the last 40 years, coinciding with the ascendancy of high tech, now the age of artificial intelligence and the race for hegemony in this domain, and the impact of social media on a world scale, leads us to a situation where society evolved very gradually toward an authoritarian path and a dilution of the liberal democratic system. Now, the fact is that this is on a world scale. This is not just in the United States. And the fact is that that high tech is not just about what its role is. Let's take the United States as an example, is what its role is at the federal government level, especially those of you who have been following the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, which was headed by Elon Musk, no longer there, of course. But it's identified with efficiency. Somehow efficiency transcends social justice. Tech efficiency, it was always a facade to suppress any issues of social justice, any issues of democracy, any issues of equity, any issues that would further accountability under the Constitution and to go beyond that in the name of what? Of tech efficiency, in the name of innovation, when in fact it has been all along all about capital formation, capital accumulation. And that's what this has been. Now, this is not an issue. I want to make sure people understand. This is not an issue about the Trump administration at all, not about the president himself, not about the GOP. This is not about that particular party. The fact is that big tech evolves from supporting, from emerging in its embryonic stage as a major player under Democrats, under Clinton, who believe that this is good for America. Like GM was good for America back in the 1950s during the Ike Eisenhower period. Well, big tech was Silicon Valley was good for America from the 1990s onward. And it starts with the Democrats. It starts with a neoliberal like Clinton, who presented himself exactly like a CEO of a Silicon Valley company. That is, he had the style and the rhetoric of a New Deal Democrat when in fact he was a neoliberal to the core and his policies were that. Obama did the exact same thing, although he too presented himself as a progressive Democrat when in fact he was as neoliberal and as pro Wall Street as Clinton. And in fact, used some of the same cabinet secretaries, used some of the same advisors, used the same democratic structure that the Clinton president used. So this is not about Republicans or Democrats. This is about a systemic issue. The analysis, the goal of the analysis here is not to place blame on one party or the other, but to look at structurally how big tech, which by the way is if a sector like big tech has 13 trillion, roughly 13 trillion market cap, it means that it's well integrated into the rest of the economy in everything from banks, okay, to retail stores. It's integrated into everything. Big tech is an integral part of the capitalist system, and not just in one country, but certainly not in the United States, but globally. So its impact is indeed global. So this is not an issue of one party or another, and it's not an issue of big tech standing alone, but rather being an integral part of the capitalist world economy and how it has managed to use its role in terms of offering security systems, surveillance systems, heavily involved in defense department, the military-industrial complex, the military-industrial complex sector, in telecommunications, involved in police and prison, in everything related to security, but also involved in data gathering, including personal data, which it has used, especially social media, to share with governments, not just the US government, but other governments as well. Now, so Silicon Valley, the big tech sector, has played an important role. Now, in order to get there, to have this role that it does, to the degree that President Trump comes in, and during the inauguration, those who saw it on television will remember behind him there were big tech executives. Okay? It wasn't the old industry executives, it was big tech. So the American national security interest, the American national economic interest was identified with this sector. And that sector is enwrapped into the entire US economy. And those people were there because they evolved from being, at least publicly, Democrats and contributing. Everybody, by the way, from Mark Zuckerberg to Elon Musk, these people who were openly, from Google executives and Amazon, were openly arguing that they, presented themselves as liberals and supporting Obama. I mean, even Elon Musk at one point had argued that he was a supporter. Elon Musk, of all people, who now publicly supports far right wing. And I'll explain some of the terminology because I don't like to throw out terms, by the way, and people for the sake of throwing out terms because they are meaningless unless they're specifically defined. Um, so we have an evolution ideologically and politically to the degree that big tech shifts by the mid 2010s toward the far right and realizes that the interests of Silicon Valley really do not rest with someone like Bernie Sanders. I bring up Bernie Sanders not because uh, he is on the anti-oligarchy tour of America with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York, but because Bernie Sanders represents that wing of the Democratic Party which is linked to Franklin Roosevelt and New Deal and the ideology of a social democracy, of a Keynesian model against the neoliberal model. That is a society with a social safety net and social welfare versus a society with a corporate welfare system where the government yields power to the private sector, especially large corporations from Goldman Sachs to obviously Elon Musk's companies to Silicon Valley companies. And this again has been an evolutionary process where the state had to get to the point that it is today in 2025 through a series of um, measures that had to do with regulation and enforcement, namely, especially during the Trump period, but even Democrats did that. Joe Biden did that as well. They gradually weakened, or in the case of Trump from the first administration, but especially in the second administration when he took power in 2025, dismantling or weakening regulatory and enforcement mechanisms and ordering the Department of Justice under Pam Bondi to really go soft or file into the archives the cases against companies that had been accused legally by the Department of Justice of defrauding consumers. So what we have is a Trump administration, for example, that had 17 US federal agencies dismiss inspectors general. When you dismiss inspectors general, you are obviously doing it for a specific reason. You don't want those individuals and their teams to go after companies that are either bending the law or violating the law. And the reason for that is because those companies have lobbied through their lawyers and lobbying offices in Washington, D.C., and have also contributed money to politicians to make sure that these measures are adopted. So, in fact, what we have seen is the state accommodating the private sector to the degree where the consumer, along with the worker, are left unprotected. And big capital, especially high tech, rises in society so hegemonic, so dominant in society, that it then tries to justify such hegemony, such power that it enjoys on the basis of what? We're indispensable. You need us. How can you possibly proceed? How can any modern society proceed without the benefit of artificial intelligence? The question is, there's nothing wrong with the technology. I'm not a Luddite, by the way. During the English Industrial Revolution, there was a group of people who were called Luddites. They were against the technology itself rather than the capitalists using the technology to, obviously, for capital accumulation and by exploiting labor of workers, the labor of workers. This is not the issue. The issue is, how is the technology used? Is the technology used for complex operations in heart surgery, for example, or brain surgery? Or is technology used to gather data of dissidents, political dissidents who disagree, and politically and ideologically with whoever is in power, and who have a different position, guaranteed guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, by the First Amendment. That's a guarantee by the First Amendment in the Constitution, by the way. And to violate the First Amendment and to violate court orders, as obviously we have seen, um, and invoke unitary executive theory, which is itself problematic, that the Trump administration has invoked, and to sideline not just independent press, but the mainstream press, everything from CBS to Reuters and Associated Press and so forth, to sideline, to somehow regiment them and to redefine the role that unless they're loyal to the specific elected government, um, then they're not going to be included, or um, they're not going to be included in the press briefings and so forth. This is and high tech facilitating a lot of that, by the way, the collection of data and so forth. And at the same time, having social media reinforce through social engineering and mass manufacturing of consent the public opinion to accept techno-authoritarianism, as many scholars call it, as the norm, is indeed shifting the liberal democratic model towards something else, and to argue into authoritarianism, basically into policies that are um, typically associated with dictatorships. Now, it's true that there's still elections, of course. However, the idea that democracy entails simply electing an individual of one of the two that are offered by the mainstream establishment, the mainstream institutional establishment, both supporting Wall Street, both supporting the military industrial complex, both immersed in the high tech mainstream and supporting that as inevitable and as the norm, without constraints, because it doesn't want them, because they interfere with the monopoly path and amassing even more uh, gains. To have that is to dilute the long-standing tradition of democracy in America. Now, the one of the more disturbing things is that there has been today, as there was in the late 19th century, the political class merging of interests with the economic class. The elites of the business sector and the political elites converging in their interests. There was always convergence of those interests. After all, the social contract under capitalism means that the political class has always served the economic class, the dominant economic class. It has served capitalism. Fair enough. Except that today, under high tech, there is more ubiquitous and universal attempt to control every aspect of society, and that's what's disturbing. What's disturbing here, and again, it has nothing to do with any specific president, because as many scholars have argued, and I have certainly mentioned this many times in writings and in videos, that if it were not for one person, it would be another. Somebody else, actually 100, 1,000 are waiting in the wings to be just like the one who's in power now. So it's not about personalities. I don't, although the cult of personality is cultivated, and the hero businessman politician like a Trump figure, for example, is celebrated. Yes, that's true. And the media, the mainstream media, as well as the social media, controlled, by the way, by big capital, promotes this. And these are the cold figures. It's no longer somebody like Albert Einstein, right? It's the businessman, politician, hero of society, the new messiah of society, promoting capital, promoting capitalist growth, such as it is, amid chaotic conditions, to be sure, but such as it is. Not social justice, not peace, capitalist growth at any cost to social justice and to peace. That's very, very important. Now, the merging of the political class interests and those of the capitalist elites is reminiscent of the Gilded Age, which Donald Trump likes to call the Golden Age. The Gilded Age, of course, of the 19th century, late 19th century. He's talking about the golden age of today, although, and it is, I agree with him, it is a golden age for the top 5%, the richest 5%. If you look at the statistics, 78% of the American people live paycheck to paycheck. Only 22% do not. So it is not a golden age for 78% of the American people. Okay? It is a golden age for the richest 5%, which, by the way, the fact is, Trump has just managed to push through Congress, push through the House, a $4.5 trillion, most of it, tax breaks for corporations and the richest Americans. To their credit, a few hundred of those billionaires have written, and they made their names public and so forth, that they really do not want that. This is not what they consider the best interest of the American economy, not best interest, especially given the fact that this 4.5 trillion is going to come out of social programs like Medicare and Medicaid, especially Medicaid, and school lunch programs and everything that has to do with the social welfare program, the social safety net. However, much of it will be added to the rising public debt of 36, closer to $37 trillion, by the way, and growing, given that there are huge rises in defense spending. So what we have here is a clear attempt to transfer income from the working class and the middle class to the richest corporations and the richest Americans. And the reason for the rise in political polarization in America is directly related to socioeconomic polarization. Americans are polarized socioeconomically to the degree that they are looking desperately for solutions. And unfortunately, many in the middle class, especially in the lower middle class, and a small segment of the working class, according to studies, including the Pew Research Center, indicate that they believe the solutions rest with an authoritarian model because they also believe public opinion polls indicate that a large segment of the American people believe we're already there anyway in terms of policies, no matter what elections indicate. Electoral process is not to be equated with social justice. It is not to be equated with democracy, by the way, which is a Greek word and it literally means ruled by the people. There is no rule by the people, it's ruled by the billionaire donors who determine public policy and policy in every institution. The latest example of all this, because it's in courts right now, is what has happened, and it's actually started. This is why I keep saying this is not the fault of Trump. This is not the fault of the Republicans. This is a structural issue. It started with Biden when he went after universities, the top administrators with some of the Ivy League universities. Let's take Harvard, for example. This started with Biden because Harvard University was simply doing what Harvard University has been doing the last 300 years, namely observing what's called academic freedom in higher education, which, by the way, is part of the constitutional guarantee. The First Amendment, the right to free speech, academic freedom is very precious. It's the rule by which universities operate. If you're going to have creative processes unleashed, you can't have constraints on creative processes. And if individuals on college campus are against the Vietnam War or the war in Ukraine or the genocide in Gaza, was still going, by the way, that's the right. That's what a pluralistic society is. U.S. was founded as a pluralistic society in the 18th century. A government coming in and saying we're going to put an end to pluralism means that that government is no longer observing the long-standing liberal democratic tradition and the Constitution itself. And as we have seen in multiple hearings in the House and the Senate, that's where you get some really intense, by the way, exchanges between obviously Democrat members of the House and the Senate against Trump administration officials who come before those committees and try to justify what they have done, whether in domestic policy, whether, for example, in the domain of the environment, where the EPA administrator has been accused of pursuing policies of deregulation that would result in rising cancer for children as well as adults, or whether it's someone like Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, question about what he has been doing, wearing multiple hats, by the way, in the national security domain, with USAID, that is U.S. foreign aid and humanitarian aid provided to the global south, especially sub-Saharan Africa, where children, and especially in East Africa, but sub-Saharan Africa in general, where children, obviously, some of those countries are dying of starvation. And that's where you get a real example of the clash between unitary executive theory, which is invoked by the Trump administration, versus what at least the Democratic Party, although they, like I said, I'm not excusing them and I'm not trying to defend them versus the Trump administration, because those Democrats are just as guilty historically when you look at the record. And By the way, scholars in the future will look back at all of this and conclude that this was a bipartisan effort to morph the state, to mold the state in such a way as to transfer capital to big companies, get as much out of the social welfare system, got everything from humanitarian aid to programs in science and environmental protection, so that we can have a lower public debt because we're giving more to billionaires, a segment of whom, to their credit, by the way, a segment of whom are saying, including Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, who are saying we don't need this money, put it in the economy, make better use of the money through economic stimulus. Don't give back direct payments, the lower taxes, because someone has to pay the bills. And the bills of the government are considerable, and the government has a role, by the way. And then the issue is, of course, what the state, what such a state, which is increasingly molded to be under the grip of the tech companies, but really big capital, complains that that the country can't be competitive against China, where the state, by the way, is hegemonic, not the private sector. The private sector is subordinate to the state. Obviously, it has thrived. There are many, many billionaires in China, including people who are involved, either directly or indirectly, with the Trump administration or Trump administration officials who have made money and through Chinese investments. And China has been there and has made trillions in the last 40 years for foreign companies. Trillions, not billions, trillions in profits. So, but the state is dominant there. State-directed capitalism. In the case of the U.S., it's Wall Street directed capitalism, the financialization of the economy, which means that the economy is measured in terms of speculative value and speculative enterprises. And here is where you have a parasitic aspect of the economy that the state facilitates, and then it blames other countries, including China, India, Europe, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. It blames other countries because the US can't be competitive when it's engaged, when at the core of its economy, there is a model within the larger neoliberal model called financialization, which is the speculative aspect is at the core of the US economy, and that is parasitic. So the parasitic nature is not looked at analytically to see maybe that's where the problem is. Let's look at it. Nor do they look at the fact that the CEO to worker ratio, CEO compensation versus worker compensation, is 550 times. That's the ratio. For every $1 a worker makes in America, the CEO makes 550. You don't have that in China, by the way. And then they wonder why NVIDIA, big company, Silicon Valley, in high tech, on artificial intelligence, has suddenly fallen behind despite massive accommodations of corporate subsidies by the state, taxpayer money, by the way, when against Chinese companies who do the exact same thing at much less and more efficiently. So if we want to talk about efficiency, how about looking at Chinese companies doing the exact same thing at lower cost, where they don't have the 550 to 1 ratio in terms of CEO to worker compensation, where they don't have Wall Street or their equivalent of Silicon Valley, their high tech, in other words, determining public policy in China, because China has a social development model. not just an economic expansion model, but a social development component. And it has the same thing when it goes to other countries through the investing through the Belt and Road Initiative program in the global south, especially, especially in the BRICS members group, whether invest in Peru or invest in sub-Saharan Africa, it has the same thing. Now, China is looked at as the enemy of the United States simply because it has moved so far ahead in the last 40 years and it's with its economy, and it has overtaken the US. They don't, in terms of GDP measured in purchasing power parity. The same analysts fail to look at the structural impediments to social and economic development in the United States, which are internal rather than coming from the outside. The outside is the pretext. So what do? What's their solution? They dig their heels in and dig deeper, a deeper hole into the same neoliberal financialization parasitic model that got them here to this mess, which the President of the United States, President Donald Trump, tried to address through sanctions against everybody. Although China was really the big target, but really it's the world. It's the world. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, rendered its verdict on that. So have other international financial organizations and so forth. And they have said what they have said about that, what they think. It's self-defeating and detrimental to the world economy, which, by the way, is one. Capitalism is one world system. And tariffs is no way to forge ahead. Again, failing to look at internal problems. I do want to address one issue that it's not, I didn't do the research for it. The surveillance and tech industry was exposed by a watchdog of big tech as pursuing policies that have often been contradictory to the rhetoric. For example, the Technology Transparency Project, an organization that examines the high-tech sector, has discovered, it's published, this is published, you can look it up, you can look it up in Google or wherever you can find it, that although the United States government has put sanctions on jihadist groups from the Middle East and Africa and the Indian subcontinent, the person that was heading the Department of Government Efficiency, Elon Musk, who happens to own the former company known as Twitter, now called X, had been doing business with some elements, according to Technology Transparency Project, with exactly the same groups. Now, it's just interesting that this has happened. Again, this is what it's been reported. It's interesting that this has happened if indeed it's cross-referenced and acknowledged by the company itself, because Elon Musk makes no secret, as of course the same thing with J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, and Donald Trump, that they are in favor of far right-wing groups and have been very critical of the European Union trying to silence such groups, of trying to regiment such groups. And it is no secret that Elon Musk has, in fact, had a history, although at one time he supported Obama, he has evolved. Like big techs like Silicon Valley, they have evolved, they have all evolved. They've lined up behind techno-authoritarianism now. And they have evolved and they have made it clear that they support far right wing policies. By the way, at this point, I do want to mention, because I said at the outset that I'm not going to engage in vacuous rhetoric about terms. The term right, center, left, really those terms have their origins in the French Revolution of 1789. When the French Revolution erupted and the revolutionists took over, depending on where the members of the assembly sat, if they sat on the right, they were conservative, more conservative. If they sat on the center, they were moderates. If they sat on the left side of the assembly, they were more progressive. So that's the origin of that. And by the 19th century, of course, those terms were more and more used widely. And the term far right obviously means someone who is not just conservative, but reactionary. Conservative means preserving the status quo. Reactionary means to go before that status quo and to go back in time and to bring back some kind of a regime that existed, let's say, today in the 21st century, some regime that existed in the 19th century. So the term authoritarian, of course, invariably is linked to third world or global south leaders, unelected, usually military dictators and so forth. It's also used to characterize some of the interwar leaders like Francisco Franco in Spain, associated with fascists and the Nazis in the 1930s, supported by them, or Antonio Salazar in Portugal, various types like that. Today, of course, conditions are different because technology allows for subtleness and for mass subtle propaganda through both mainstream and social media to present as the norm a liberal society as somehow democratic simply because voters are essentially given the choice of voting for candidate X, Y, or Z, let's say, in those countries where there are multi-party systems. In the case of the United States, voting for either Democrats or Republicans because the independents don't have a chance. And somehow that equates with democracy, when in fact it has very little to do with democracy, because democracy is about what policies are implemented that benefit the people, because again, the word democracy means rule by the people, accountability to the people, not accountability to Wall Street, but accountability or to Silicon Valley, but to the people. Now, I want to go back to the surveillance issue and the Technology Transparency Project and how this group exposed the contradiction of companies that claim to be against terrorism, against jihadists, and so forth, and yet through back channels are doing business with such people. That's one issue. Now, we don't have to take the Technology Transparency Project word for this. Let's say they exaggerated. All we have to do is look at US House and Senate testimony where we have seen examples under question especially by Democrats, where they're questioning government officials, cabinet secretaries and undersecretaries, they're questioning them and trying to figure out why there is a deregulation path with respect to both domestic and foreign uh, oligarchs, capitalist interests, and with powerful entities, and how the state is really morphed, it's molded to accommodate them when it claims that it's there to fight corruption and to pursue the rule of law and so forth, but in fact, not doing so. This is in congressional testimony, multiple videos that you can see that are available in YouTube on this issue. Now, the final point I want to make is the question of a country above the law, a country that doesn't observe its own constitution, a country that doesn't observe its own laws, a country that doesn't observe the rulings by its own courts, a country where the institutional structure seems to be subordinated to the loyalty of a political party or individuals. That is what authoritarianism is. When you add technology to it, and when you add the fact that high tech is presenting itself as the savior of society for both the state, because it's going to come in, take over federal bureaucracies, techno-fit the federal bureaucracies, make them more efficient rather than labor intensive, that'll be capital intensive at the cost of hundreds of billions to the taxpayer. And somehow this translates to democracy. It does not. Artificial intelligence has absolutely nothing to do with democracy. It's about capital accumulation. That's all it is. It is a tool that's used to make a lot of people very wealthy. Very few people, those a lot of people who are involved in that as investors, not a lot of people in the broader scheme of things in society, and at the expense of the rest of the population. I want to thank you for listening. I want to invite you to ask questions and write comments and to subscribe to this channel, which is educational. The only goal here is to analyze issues on their merits. Thank you very much.